The document was 3 pages long, typed, not handwritten, recovered from a captured German battalion commander somewhere along the Tobruk perimeter, translated by Australian intelligence, and filed in a cabinet at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, where it sat for decades before a US Army researcher pulled it out and read it twice. It contained a sentence that no German officer should have written about any enemy. Not in 1941. Not when the Wehrmacht had crushed Poland in 5 weeks, France in 6, and was driving across North Africa like it owned the continent. The sentence read, "The Australian is unquestionably superior to the German soldier, not comparable, not a worthy adversary." Superior, and the officer who wrote it wasn't being diplomatic. He listed the specifics. Superior in the use of individual weapons, especially as snipers. Superior in the use of ground camouflage. Superior in observation and in drawing the correct conclusions from that observation. Superior in every means of taking the enemy by surprise. He added a warning about his own troops. Our men, usually easygoing and unsuspecting, fall easily into his traps. He wrote it the way a man writes something that has cost him personally, because it had. His battalion had been fed into Tobruk's perimeter and come back missing most of its strength. Rommel read assessments like this, and he kept attacking anyway, for 242 days. This is the story of why he couldn't stop, and who tried to steal the credit when it was over. By April 1941, Erwin Rommel had a problem that looked like a victory. He'd arrived in Libya 2 months earlier, with orders to hold the line. Instead, he'd driven the British out of Cyrenaica entirely, 500 miles of desert taken in a fortnight. Benghazi fell, Derna fell. The British were running east so fast they were abandoning equipment along the road. Rommel was doing what Rommel did, ignoring his orders, trusting his instincts, and moving faster than anyone thought possible, but he'd outrun his supply chain. His base at Tripoli was now 900 miles behind him, 1,500 kilometers of open desert between his forward units and the nearest port that could feed them. And sitting on that supply line, refusing to fall, was a single fortified port, Tobruk. The garrison was built around the Australian 9th Division under Major General Leslie Morshead, a schoolteacher's son from Ballarat who'd fought at Gallipoli as a 25-year-old and come home with a reputation for 2 things: meticulous planning and absolute stubbornness. He was 52 now, thin-faced, quiet in a way that made staff officers nervous because when Morshead went quiet, he was usually about to tell you something you didn't want to hear. Chester Wilmot, the ABC war correspondent who spent months inside the perimeter, described his approach in 5 words. His whole doctrine was aggression. The 9th Division was not the cream of the Australian Imperial Force. The 6th Division, the one that had actually captured Tobruk from the Italians 3 months earlier, had been shipped to Greece. What Morshead had were the units left behind, the 20th, 24th, and 26th Brigades. Many of their men had never been in combat. Some battalions had arrived in the Middle East only weeks before. Farmers, bank clerks, bricklayers, men whose military training consisted of a few months at Pukapunyal or Ingleburn before being loaded onto a troop ship. But they had the perimeter, 35 miles of it, an anti-tank ditch dug by Italian prisoners in 1940, a double apron barbed wire fence, and a series of concrete strongpoints, what the Australians called posts, numbered R1 through R67, S1 through S38, and so on around the compass. The Italians had built them facing south and west. The Australians now stood in them facing the same direction, waiting for something very different from the Italian army to arrive. Rommel needed this port. Without it, every truck driving east to supply his front line had to detour 50 miles inland, over tracks that shredded tires and swallowed fuel. The garrison, unconquered, threatened the supply lines to any units pushed east toward Egypt. As the US National World War II Museum's assessment concluded, the unconquered garrison rendered the drive across the desert pointless. The German High Command in Berlin sent General Friedrich Paulus, the same Paulus who would later surrender an entire army at Stalingrad, specifically to tell Rommel that Tobruk had to fall before any advance on Egypt could continue. Morshead had his own views on the situation. He made them clear to Chester Wilmot in terms that defined the siege before it properly began. "There will be no Dunkirk here. If we should have to get out, we shall fight our way out. There is to be no surrender and no retreat." His operational concept, documented in his orders and later in his 1947 lecture at the AWM, rested on 4 pillars: no ground given up voluntarily, domination of no man's land through nightly, deep patrolling, relentless improvement of defensive positions, and defense organized in depth with a large mobile reserve held behind the front line. Every one of those pillars would be tested within the week. Rommel understood his side of the equation. He told his diary, "To every man of us, Tobruk was a symbol of British resistance, and we were now going to finish with it for good." He was wrong about that, and the reason he was wrong has to do with what happened on Easter Sunday. Good Friday, 11th April 1941. German armoured cars appeared on the southern perimeter, probing runs, testing where the wire was weakest, where the anti-tank ditch had collapsed, where the Australian positions were thinnest. That same day, on the western approaches, the commander of the 15th Panzer Division, General Heinrich von Prittwitz, drove his vehicle too close to the perimeter. An Australian anti-tank round killed him. He was the first German general to die in the Desert War, and he died before the siege was officially 48 hours old. Rommel didn't pause. The night of Easter Sunday, April 13th, he sent the 8th Machine Gun Battalion under Lieutenant Colonel Gustav Ponath through the wire near Post R33, the 217th Battalion sector. Ponath's men breached the perimeter in darkness and pushed north. What happened next is documented in the citation for the first Australian Victoria Cross of the Second World War. Lieutenant Austin McKell gathered a bayonet counterattack party, 6 men. One of them was Corporal John Hurst Edmondson, 27 years old, from Wagga Wagga, New South Wales. A farmer before the war, big hands, the kind of man who could split a fence post and carry it under one arm. During the fight at the breach, Edmondson was wounded in the neck and the stomach. He kept fighting, killed at least 2 German soldiers with his bayonet, saved McKell's life, and died of his wounds before sunrise on Easter Monday. His Victoria Cross was gazetted on July 1st, 1941, posthumous, but the breach held, and on Easter Monday morning, Rommel sent what he had left of the 5th Panzer Regiment through the gap, 38 tanks funneling along the El Adem Road, crossing the anti-tank ditch one at a time through the morning fog. Standard blitzkrieg. Tanks lead, infantry follows, defenders scatter. The Australians didn't scatter. They did something the Germans had never encountered in this war. Morshead's standing orders were explicit, and the men of the 20th Brigade followed them. Let the tanks pass through. Don't engage the armour from the front. Stay in your positions. Wait for the infantry behind the tanks, the men on foot, the ones who can't hide behind steel plate, and kill them. The tanks rolled through the red line. The Australian infantry held their ground, waited, and then cut the German foot soldiers to pieces with small arms fire. 38 tanks now found themselves 4,000 yards inside the perimeter with no infantry support, heading north into the Blue Line, where 32 25-pounder guns were waiting, firing over open sights, point blank, at tanks that had nowhere to turn. 5 tanks destroyed immediately. The rest reversed and ran. Think about what that means. In Poland, the tanks went through and the army collapsed behind them. In France, the tanks went through and the army collapsed behind them. In Libya, against the British, the tanks went through and the army collapsed behind them. Every time, every country. The doctrine said, once armor breaches the main defensive line, the battle is over. At Tobruk, the tanks went through and the Australians stayed exactly where they were. A captured German enlisted soldier, processed through Australian intelligence, said it plainly. I cannot understand you Australians. In Poland, France, and Belgium, once the tanks got through, the soldiers took it for granted that they were beaten. But you are like demons. The tanks break through, and your infantry still keep fighting. Easter battle casualties. Axis. 150 killed, 250 captured, 29 tanks destroyed. Out of roughly 112 available, 17 aircraft shot down. The garrison lost 26 killed and 24 wounded. Ponath himself was dead by the 14th. His 8th Machine Gun Battalion, which had entered the battle at roughly 1,400 men, came out with about 300 effective. 75% losses, in 4 days. Rommel wrote home on the 25th of April, Anzac Day, though he wouldn't have known that. His letter described the Australian prisoners he'd seen. Immensely big and powerful men who without question represented an elite formation of the British Empire, a fact that was also evident in battle. In the same letter, he noted that his Italian allies had been creeping under their vehicles and refusing their officers' orders to come out during the shelling. He didn't stop. Rommel never stopped. On the evening of April 30th, he launched his heaviest assault, the Battle of the Salient. The newly arrived 15th Panzer Division, the 5th Light Division, Italian Ariete and Brescia divisions, Stuka support, artillery preparation, everything he could muster hitting the southwestern perimeter at Ras el Medouar. The Germans broke through on a 3-mile front and pushed 2 miles deep. The 224th Battalion bore the worst of it, lost about half their strength in fighting so close that men were throwing grenades into each other's positions. The concrete posts changed hands multiple times in a single night. Men who'd been farmers 6 months ago were fighting hand to hand in darkness against veterans of the European campaign. Australian counterattacks on the 3rd of May recovered some ground, but not all. The salient would remain contested for the rest of the siege, a finger of German-held territory inside the perimeter, bled over daily by both sides. Rommel's own account: in this assault we lost more than 1,200 men killed, wounded and missing. He called off the offensive on the 4th of May, but the Australians hadn't only been absorbing punishment. Between the Easter Battle and the Salient, the 248th Battalion, a South Australian unit that would become one of the most effective infantry battalions in the Desert War, ran a series of counterattacks that read like something from a different century. On April 16th, they hit the Italian Ariete division so hard they captured 803 prisoners in a single action. Essentially, the entire 1st Battalion of the Italian 62nd Regiment walked into the Tobruk cage with their hands up. 6 days later, on the 22nd of April, C Company of the same battalion charged Carrier Hill with bayonets and came back with approximately 370 more. The 223rd Battalion, that same day, crossed the Derna Road and added another 100 from the Brescia Division. And later, July, August, Brigadier Murray's 20th Brigade ran a psychological operation that tells you everything about how these men thought about the siege. Australian patrols carried stencils reading V per Vittorio, V for victory, and attached them to enemy bodies, wire posts, sandbags, anything the Italians would see at dawn, inside Italian lines. The message wasn't subtle. We were here while you were sleeping, and there was nothing you could do about it. Rommel never breached Tobruk again. So the question becomes, what do you do when you're surrounded, outnumbered, and the enemy has decided he can't break through your front door? You go out through it. Morshead's doctrine, and this is documented in his orders, in his 1947 lecture held at the Australian War Memorial and in Chester Wilmot's reporting from inside the perimeter, rested on a single conviction. From the first day I determined that no man's land would be our land. Not a defensive posture, an offensive one. Every night, up to 200 men from each battalion went out through the wire with bayonets, grenades and wire cutters. Their orders, in Morshead's own words, were to do as much damage as you can without getting caught. They weren't holding the line. They were owning everything in front of it. Sergeant Jack Weston of the 248th Battalion, the men called him Tex, completed 23 documented patrols by the end of July alone, navigating by stars across terrain that looked identical in every direction, flat, featureless desert broken only by scrub and wire. Moving through minefields the Australians had mapped by hand, metre by metre, marking safe lanes with stones or cloth strips that were invisible to anyone who didn't know where to look. Coming back before dawn with prisoners, intelligence, and enemy weapons, and the quiet certainty that the Germans were afraid to come out at night, because they were. In July 1941 alone, Australian patrols killed an estimated 180 enemy soldiers through what the reports euphemistically called bombs and bayonets. The Germans and Italians stopped patrolling aggressively. They ceded no man's land entirely, sat behind their wire and waited for morning. exactly as Morshead intended. Morshead's reasoning was characteristically blunt. Nothing would sap the troops' morale as much as idleness. But it was more than therapy. He was drawing on a specific tactical tradition, the peaceful penetration raids that Australian battalions had perfected on the Western Front in 1918. Small teams, surprise entry, maximum disruption, withdraw before the enemy can organize a response. What had worked against the Kaiser's army a generation earlier worked against Rommel's. Many of the men at Tobruk were literally the sons of the diggers who developed these tactics in France. The knowledge passed through families, through pub stories, through a military culture that valued cunning over mass. And then there were the bush gunners. When the 6th Division captured Tobruk from the Italians in January 1941, they inherited roughly 200 Italian artillery pieces, most of them abandoned, some damaged, all of them without anyone trained to fire them. Lieutenant Colonel Francis Cook organized what he called half-day classes in how to load, aim, and fire an Italian gun with the least risk to the firer and the maximum to the enemy. The students were whoever was available: cooks, clerks, storemen, men whose military occupational specialty had nothing to do with artillery. They used lanyards of telephone wire 100 feet long so the person pulling the firing cord could be as far as possible from the thing when it went off. They chocked wheels to gain elevation because the elevation mechanisms were broken or missing. Italian 75mm, 100mm, and 149mm field pieces, all reconditioned with whatever tools and parts could be scrounged. 42 captured Italian 20mm Breda anti-aircraft guns were operated by the 2 3rd Light AA Regiment. The 228th Battalion War Diary for April 7th records personnel pulling 5 Italian 75mm field pieces into position overnight, along with their ammunition, by hand, across open ground in the dark. A photograph in the Australian War Memorial Collection, catalogue number C13844, shows the spirit perfectly. The caption reads, "Most of the bush gunners are odd job men who perform their usual duties in addition to their shooting activities." In the photograph, the cook can be seen at his position still wearing his apron. A cook, firing captured Italian artillery, still wearing his apron. Chester Wilmot noted that the first firing session was more menacing to personnel in the vicinity than to the enemy's armored cars, but they improved. The US Army's Combat Studies Institute assessment concluded that the bush artillery completely outgunned the Germans' few field pieces. Meanwhile, the garrison printed a newspaper. The Tobruk Truth, the dinkum oil, being Australian slang for the honest truth, ran from the 16th of February 1941 to the 20th of October 1941. Roughly 247 consecutive issues. Edited by Sergeant Bill Williams, a former journalist from the Oakley Times in Victoria who recorded BBC shorthand broadcasts, typed them onto wax stencils, and ran copies on what he described as a dilapidated office duplicator. The paper's boast was that it always appears, proved it, when a 1,500-pound bomb landed on the building where it was produced. Published on schedule the next morning, rushed out a special edition when Rudolf Hess parachuted into Scotland on May 10th, 1941. The only complete surviving set, Williams' own file copy, sits in the National Library of Australia. When a British propaganda film crew arrived and produced a reel titled "Tobruk Can Take It," Morshead watched it and reportedly said, "We're not here to take it, we're here to give it." Stay with me on the numbers for a moment, because the cost of keeping Tobruk alive was paid in ships. The Tobruk Ferry Service, important enough to earn its own Admiralty Battle Summary, number 52, ran from May to December 1941 under Captain Albert Poland's Inshore Squadron. Destroyers left Alexandria in the early morning, arrived at Tobruk around midnight, unloaded supplies, loaded wounded, then shuttled to Mersa Matruh before a second run. Admiral Cunningham's official report documents the throughput: 34,115 troops evacuated, 32,667 fresh troops delivered, 7,516 wounded transported, 72 tanks and 92 guns delivered, and 33,946 tons of stores, plus 108 live sheep for the Indian troops in the garrison. The runs could only happen during moonless periods. Otherwise, Luftwaffe bombers had clear targets against the dark water. 26 ships sunk running this service. 2 destroyers, 3 sloops, 1 fast mine layer, 20 smaller vessels. Naval personnel, 469 killed or missing, 186 wounded. Merchant service, 70 killed or missing, 55 wounded. The Australian Scrap Iron Flotilla, 5 aging V and W class destroyers. Stuart, Vampire, Vendetta, Voyager, Waterhen, bore heavy duty. HMAS Waterhen became the first Royal Australian Navy warship lost to enemy action in the war, hit by dive bombers on the 30th of June on her 13th Tobruk run. No crew killed, which felt like borrowed luck. HMAS Parramatta wasn't so fortunate. Torpedoed by U-559 on 27th November while escorting an ammunition ship to Tobruk. Only 24 survived from a crew of 162. The garrison survived because sailors died getting supplies through. The infantry knew this. The official histories sometimes forgot to emphasize it. Here's the thing about the patrol reports, the bush artillery, the garrison newspaper, the ferry service. None of this was ordered from above by some British general at a desk in Cairo. The Australians did it because it needed doing, and the British chain of command above them either couldn't or wouldn't provide alternatives. This was Morshead's philosophy made physical. You are under siege, so you fight. You don't have proper guns, so you fix the ones lying around. You don't have information, so you print your own. The captured German battalion commander's assessment was specific on this point. He wrote that the German soldier was usually easygoing and unsuspecting, and fell easily into traps set by Australian patrols. He noted the Australians' gift of observation and the drawing of the correct conclusions from his observation. Not bravery as an abstract quality, skill, tradecraft, the kind of superiority that embarrasses you because it means the other man was simply better at the job. While the 9th Division was holding Tobruk, a different battle was being fought in London, and this one, the Australians lost. 3 successive Australian Prime Ministers, Menzies, Fadden, and Curtin, pressed Churchill on the same point. Get our soldiers out of Tobruk, not because they were failing, because they were being used. The fact that the same demand survived 3 changes of government tells you it wasn't political opportunism, it was national policy. Robert Menzies had visited London from February to May 1941. He came back shaken. His diary entry from 14th March, "The cabinet is deplorable. Dumb men, most of whom disagree with Winston, but none of whom dare say so. This state of affairs is dangerous. The chiefs of staff are without exception yes men. Winston is a dictator. He cannot be overruled." That's the Australian Prime Minister, writing in his private diary about the British Prime Minister. In the middle of a war, they were fighting together. The issue was relief. By July 1941, the Australian government wanted its soldiers out of Tobruk. Not because they were losing. They were winning, as the German casualty figures proved, because they were exhausted, sick, and being used as a garrison while the British planned their next offensive. General Thomas Blamey, commanding all Australian forces in the Middle East, made the formal request. His cable of 1st May 1941 to Australian Minister for the Army Percy Spender had already signalled alarm. On returning Egypt, I find the AIF distributed among several forces and 10 different areas. His stated reasons for relief were clear: troop health deterioration, the need to reconstitute the AIF as a single force, and the principle that Australian formations should fight under Australian command, not scattered across the desert at someone else's convenience. Churchill said no. His stated reasons were operational. Pulling the Australians out would require naval convoys during moonless periods. The Royal Navy couldn't spare the ships. It would delay the planned Crusader offensive. The risk to shipping was too great. His private reasoning was different. In a cable to the Minister of State in Egypt, never intended for Australian eyes, Churchill wrote, "I was astounded at Australian government's decision, being sure it would be repudiated by Australia if the facts could be made known. Allowances must be made for a government with a majority only of one faced by a bitter opposition, parts of which at least are isolationist in outlook. Read that again. Churchill wasn't arguing military logistics. He was dismissing the Australian government as politically weak and hoping the Australian public would override its own elected leaders. The man whose soldiers were dying in the desert was being told his government didn't really mean what it said. The confrontation that followed is documented in John Hetherington's biography of Blamey. When Commander-in-Chief Middle East General Claude Auchinleck told Blamey flatly that Tobruk could not be relieved, Blamey responded, "Gentlemen, I think you don't understand the position. If I were a French or an American commander making this demand, what would you say about it?" Auchinleck's reply, "But you're not." 4 words, meaning you're a colonial. You don't get to demand. Blamey, that is where you are wrong. Australia is an independent nation. She came into the war under certain definite agreements. Now, gentlemen, in the name of my government, I demand the relief of these troops. Professor David Horner of the Australian National University assessed this as a significant step in the development of Australian command. And the Australian government backed Blamey. It was the first really important difference between Churchill and the Australian government. The relief happened in 3 lifts under fire during moonless periods. The Royal Navy called the first operation Treacle because they expected it to be a sticky business. The 18th Brigade came out in August, replaced by the Polish Carpathian Independent Rifle Brigade. The 24th Brigade came out in September, replaced by British 16th Infantry Brigade. Most of the remaining Australians came out in October, but not all of them. On the last run, the fast mine layer HMS Latona was sunk on October 25th. The operation was curtailed. The 213th Battalion, the only Australian unit that had been present for the entire siege from April 10th onward, couldn't be evacuated. They stayed, and they were still there on November 29th when they launched a night bayonet attack at Ed Duda Ridge during Operation Crusader. The last Australian unit didn't leave Tobruk until December 10th, 1941. Here's the timing that matters. Morshead handed command to Major General Ronald Scobie on October 22nd. Operation Crusader launched on the 18th of November. The siege was lifted on the 7th of December, which means the British 71st Division, the replacements, were present for the breakout, not the Australians who'd held the fortress for 5 months. Churchill's memoirs, The Grand Alliance, framed the Australian withdrawal as politically motivated rather than militarily justified. The Australian official historian Barton Morn spent years and hundreds of pages dismantling this claim. His assessment, if the Australian people had relied solely on Churchill's account, they might have been left with some erroneous impressions, particularly the impression that Australia insisted on relief not because of a strong conviction based on broad considerations advanced by its military advisors, but because it had been induced by hard pressure from its political opponents to ignore Churchill's entreaties. The Imperial War Museum's own account notes that Australians provided the mainstay of the Tobruk Defence Force until August, then pivots to British forces lifted the siege on December 10th, 1941 during Operation Crusader. Both statements are true. Together, they create a lie. Morshead knew what was happening. Churchill's wartime signal to him praised your steadfast and spirited defence of this important outpost of Egypt as an empire effort. Empire, not Australian. The word was deliberate, and at El Alamein later, British command attempted to split 9th Division brigades among British divisions. Morshead resisted, remembering Blamey's standing orders. The same fight, different desert. So who told the truth? The Germans did, not voluntarily, not generously, but the captured documents, the private letters, the post-war assessments, they form a record that neither Churchill nor the British war machine could edit. Rommel, writing privately to his wife, letters he never expected to be published, described the Australians as an elite formation of the British Empire. By mid-1942 at El Alamein, his institutional memory was explicit. Fierce fighting followed with the Australians, whom we knew only too well from the time of the Tobruk siege. He documented an Australian brigade-strength night assault that succeeded in penetrating our front and wiping out the greater part of the German battalion before a counter-attack could stabilise the line. The captured battalion commander listed 4 categories of superiority, not 1, 4: individual weapons, camouflage, observation, surprise. That document sat in the US Army's archives at Fort Leavenworth until Colonel Ward Miller pulled it for his 1986 monograph. The Germans had written the Australians' performance review, and it read better than anything the British ever published about them. And then there's the proof that arrived 17 months later, the proof nobody wanted. On June 20th, 1942, Rommel attacked Tobruk again, different garrison. Roughly 35,000 troops under Major General H.B. Klopper of the 2nd South African Division, a man who'd been appointed on the 14th of May and had no combat command experience. 6 weeks in command of a fortress that Morshead had held for 5 months. The minefields that had channeled German armour into killing zones had been removed for the Gazala line. The anti-tank ditches had collapsed or been deliberately filled during the December breakout. Nobody had repaired them. Air support had withdrawn to Sidi Barrani, hundreds of miles east, completely out of range. The Desert Air Force could not cover the garrison. The anti-tank defense consisted of 15 6-pounder guns. 15. Morshed's garrison had fielded hundreds of captured Italian pieces alone, crewed by cooks and storemen who taught themselves to shoot, and most critically, there was no aggressive patrolling doctrine, no nightly raids to dominate no man's land, no culture of taking the fight to the enemy while surrounded. The garrison sat inside the wire and waited for Rommel to come to them. He did. The fortress fell in approximately 24 hours. German 21st and 15th Panzer Divisions smashed through the southeastern perimeter. By 5 o'clock, the port was reached. Klopper surrendered at 9:40 the following morning. 33,000 prisoners taken, the second largest British and Commonwealth capitulation of the war after Singapore. The Germans also captured 2,000 tons of fuel, 5,000 tons of provisions, and 2,000 vehicles. Same fortress, same perimeter, same port. 24 hours instead of 242 days. No Morshead, no aggressive patrolling doctrine, no bush gunners in aprons, no patrols going out 200 strong every night to own no man's land, no garrison newspaper publishing through bombing raids, no 248th Battalion capturing 803 Italian prisoners in a single counterattack, no Corporal Edmondson fighting with a bayonet through wounds that were already killing him. The contrast is the evidence, and the evidence doesn't require an argument. Churchill received the news at the White House during the Second Washington Conference. He wrote, "I did not attempt to hide from the President the shock I had received. It was a bitter moment. Defeat is one thing, disgrace is another." Disgrace, the word Churchill used when Tobruk fell without Australians in it. Roosevelt, sitting across from Churchill when the news arrived, asked one question: what can we do to help? General Marshall ordered 300 M4 Sherman tanks and 100 M7 Priest self-propelled guns dispatched to the Middle East. Rommel was promoted to Field Marshal at age 49 for taking the fortress that the Australians had held for 8 months. The Tobruk withdrawal wasn't the end of the story between Churchill and Australia. It was the precedent. In 1942, Churchill attempted to divert the 7th Australian Division to Burma without Australian Prime Minister Curtin's agreement. Curtin's response, published in the Melbourne Herald on the 27th of December 1941, contained a sentence that broke 80 years of imperial deference. Without any inhibitions of any kind, I make it quite clear that Australia looks to America, free of any pangs as to our traditional links or kinship with the United Kingdom. That sentence started at Tobruk, in the cables, in the arguments over ships and moonless nights, and whose soldiers had earned the right to decide where they fought. German propaganda radio, most accounts credit William Joyce, Lord Haw-Haw, broadcasting from Hamburg, called the Tobruk garrison poor desert rats, caught like rats in a trap, living like rats underground. The exact wording isn't preserved in any verified transcript, an important distinction. Different sources give different versions. Poor desert rats of Tobruk, caught like rats in a trap, living like rats in underground dugouts and caves. The Anzac Day Commemoration Committee dates the broadcast to approximately mid-1941. Some sources attribute it to Radio Berlin rather than Joyce personally. since multiple English-language propagandists operated from Hamburg. The intent was clear: humiliation. You are trapped. You are vermin waiting to be exterminated. The Australians heard it and laughed. Then they took it. Senator W.P. Ashley, Australian Minister for Information, wrote in January 1942, "Our men accepted the title with relish. To one another they were the rats. To the Axis they were rats with razor-sharp teeth. They painted rats on their equipment." The Australian War Memorial holds photographs of a Bren gun marked with a cigarette-smoking rat and the words, "Rats to you." Joyce also tried Ali Baba Morshead and his 20,000 thieves. That one didn't stick the same way. The men preferred the one that sounded like a fight, and then 3 sappers made it permanent. Corporal Leslie Dufton of the 2nd 13th Field Company Engineers, working with Corporal Roy Costello and Sapper Frederick Bignell, spent 3 evenings during the siege crafting metals from aluminium salvaged from a wrecked German aircraft and copper from the driving bands of shell cases. Enemy wreckage beaten into identity over 3 nights using whatever tools they had. With support from Major August Garrison, a die was created. A jeweler in Palestine later struck at least 500 medals using that die. The die was subsequently destroyed after the metal was ruled illegal. A surviving example sold at Noble Numismatics in 2014 for $1,300 Australian dollars. An unofficial medal, made from a dead German bomber, honoring a name given by German propaganda. Worn by soldiers, the German army's own captured officers called unquestionably superior. The Rats of Tobruk Association formed on the 26th of October 1944 in New South Wales. The Victorian branch followed on the 2nd of October 1945, 60 rats attending the founding meeting. Morshead himself opened Tobruk House at 44 Victoria Avenue, Albert Park, Melbourne on 29th September 1956. The association funded the Rats of Tobruk ward at the Royal Children's Hospital, a neuroscience ward, because these men knew what damage looked like from the inside. They struck a 50th anniversary medallion through the Royal Australian Mint in 1991. The memorial on Anzac Parade in Canberra was unveiled on the 13th of April 1983 by Governor General Sir Ninian Stephen. Designed by Denton Corker Marshall, it incorporates the original inscription stone from the wartime Tobruk Cemetery, the only surviving relic, which at one point had been repurposed as the front step of the Tobruk post office before someone recognized what it was. The inscription reads, "This is hallowed ground, for here lie those who died for their country." A time capsule laid beneath it in 1991 contains a Tobruk medal, a German propaganda pamphlet urging Australians to surrender, and a map of Tobruk. The pamphlet and the medal buried together. That's the whole story in 2 objects. The 9th Division's total casualties at Tobruk, 749 killed, 1,996 wounded, 604 captured, including attached troops through the full siege, 832 killed, 2,177 wounded, 941 captured. Estimated total Axis casualties during the siege, approximately 8,000. Chester Wilmot, the ABC correspondent who'd reported from inside the perimeter, who'd pioneered frontline interviews that incorporated the actual sounds of battle. Shells exploding, machine gun fire, soldiers' voices recorded under fire, techniques that were revolutionary for radio in 1941, who'd been wounded by shrapnel covering Operation Crusader on November 25, 1941, was killed on January 10, 1954. BOAC Flight 781, a de Havilland comet, broke apart over the Mediterranean. He'd been commissioned to write the official Australian history of Tobruk and El Alamein. His research papers, drafts, notes, interview transcripts from inside the perimeter survive at the National Library of Australia. The definitive account, by the man who'd been there, died with him over the sea. The task passed to Barton Morn, who spent the next 12 years assembling the record that Churchill's memoirs had tried to reshape. Morshead came home, resumed civilian life, gave a lecture at the Australian War Memorial in 1947. The transcript is filed under PGR3DRL 2632, where he laid out his methods with the quiet precision of a man who'd spent 6 years being proven right and didn't feel the need to raise his voice about it. He died in 1959. The 9th Division's units adopted uniform T-shaped color patches reflecting Tobruk's significance, a marking they carried for the rest of the war into El Alamein, into the Pacific. The Anzac Memorial in Sydney holds a soil sample from Tobruk in its Hall of Service floor. The memorial's official assessment draws the line directly. In some ways, Tobruk became, for Australia in the Second World War, what Gallipoli had been in the Great War. Both campaigns saw novice troops endure hardship in a harsh summer, defending a small perimeter, in the process creating a reputation for toughness and skill. Many of the men at Tobruk were literally the sons of Gallipoli veterans. The tradition wasn't metaphorical. It was blood and inheritance. The last known surviving rat of Tobruk died in August 2024. He was 102. The captured German assessment, the one that opened this story, was filed in Kansas, written in a language most Australians can't read about a battle most of the world has already half forgotten, but the sentence remains. The Australian is unquestionably superior to the German soldier. The Australians didn't write that. They didn't need to.